Well, hello everybody. Assalamu alaikum. It's with great pleasure that for those who are joining us tonight, that we have an inspiring guest who has been kind of connected with the CCMW. He's given an inspirational talk with the My Canada, the Muslim Youth Canada project, a few years back when Rizwan was the national coordinator, and now we're back again. And this time, and I really liked your choice of language, the global conversation. Abdul-Rahman is joining us from the UK, so it's about midnight there, or 1 a.m. at this point. Um, Abdul-Rahman is a London-based journalist, educator, and organizer. He's currently programs manager for UK-based Radical Middle Way, an organization that gives young Muslims the inspiration and tools to enable positive social change, promote social justice, and combat exclusion and violence. Abdul-Rahman will be discussing the important question of bringing global political issues to a local and meaningful space. He'll speak about his own personal experience as a community activist, and we'll look at the ethical, moral, and spiritual foundations of resilience. So the way it's going to work tonight is that for those who are joining us on the YouTube page, you can write your questions, and I will share the questions into the conversation. And we're really going to try to do an informal thing. It won't be a 1-hour speech, but really try to engage in that conversation, and yeah, we'll go from there. So without further ado, I present to you Abdul-Rehman Malik.
Thank you, Stefan, and I'm glad we were able to sort out our transatlantic telecommunications difficulties. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome, everyone. It's just coming up to midnight here in London, but it's a great honor to be with those of you who are there. I think the issue that we're going to be talking about tonight, I think, is pertinent on a number of different levels. And in the next few minutes, I want to sort of draw on some of my experiences, not just over the last 10 years that I've been involved with the Radical Middle Way, but I would actually say to draw on life experience of what for me as a activist in particular, the whole notion of trauma, and particularly global trauma, has meant. And then I'd like to move the conversation on to sort of defining what that means and the various levels at which that operates within our communities. And then finally to think about what we as activists and organizers can do to facilitate spaces and conversations which are spaces and conversations which heal and don't harm, but at the same time spaces and conversations which move the agenda of our community forward, not only towards healing and resilience, but towards winning and growth. I think what's interesting for me is that in my own sort of life experience, the whole notion of trauma, politically trauma caused by politics, by migration, by crises that cause diasporas to exist, in a way was sort of foreign to me. I was born in Canada, the son of immigrants. I wouldn't say that my parents were particularly privileged, but I think I grew into privilege as my parents sort of assumed elements of what it meant to be Canadian in terms of work and employment and so on. But I grew up from almost the first, I would say probably the first moments of my life, into a household that was deeply connected to not just Pakistan, which was the country my parents came from, but which was deeply connected to what was going on in what we would term in inverted commas the Muslim world. I grew up in a house where my parents watched very carefully what was happening at that time in Iran, what was happening in Palestine, which was, of course, what was happening in the subcontinent and elsewhere. And the mid to late 1970s were a really poignant time for politically around the world. And I think that in many ways, what was happening around the world was constantly coming in to the home, whether that was through television news, but really through newspapers and magazines. And I remember we'd be getting magazines from activists in the Iranian diaspora, people involved in Islamic movements in the Middle East. Magazines like in the late 1970s, early 1980s, like Arabia and South and Afghar Inquiry and Impact International. These were sort of touchstones for us as I sort of grew up watching the quote unquote ummah explode into all kinds of revolutions and political issues and resistance against occupation and so on. And so in some ways, there was always a sense in my life that I was part of a global community that was not only in flux, but that was in crisis. I remember that one of my earliest memories is standing out in the minus 20 or minus 30 degrees Celsius weather, protesting against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. I remember that our family almost every year without fail went to Nathan Phillips Square and marched to the Russian consulate to protest the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. It became a very important part of our yearly calendar. And we felt incredibly passionate about it. When I looked around me in those early days, what I saw, of course, were brothers and sisters from the Afghan community, but more so brothers and sisters from all kinds of other communities within the broader Muslim community. And there was always this sense and this narrative of ummah, of global community, that we were connected and that we were in a state of crisis and that crisis needed to be resolved. And we felt deeply the sense of pain and the sense of agony around what was happening in Palestine, what was happening in Afghanistan, or what was happening in Lebanon with Sabra and Shatila, and having seen those things through the early 1980s, being incredibly aware of what was happening. I think that was in a way interesting. It was interesting to grow up in that milieu and in that dynamic. But it was also interesting now reflecting back on it. It was interesting growing up with a sense of being part of a community that was in crisis, and being part of a community that was now occupied, and that was a community that no longer was a global community of influence. And there was that mythology and that sense of something lost. And it was part of the kind of the narrative that was built around what it meant to be part of the Muslim Ummah. And in many ways, those early activist years were trying to almost, reestablish a kind of a vanguard of giving honor and justice back to the global Muslim community. Now, of course, over the years, my own sense of what that meant changed, and I think for my parents and for my father in particular, I think that changed. But nevertheless, I don't think it's ever left me that sense of being connected, and in fact, that sense of being part of an ummah, being part of a global community that was in crisis, and now we can almost describe it as being in trauma, was actually quite influential in the way in my own journey as an activist and as an actor in the community in Toronto and then later on. And I think a lot of the decisions that I made in my own life about the movements which I joined, about the causes that I took on, were in many ways influenced by that upbringing of being part of this community that was in trauma and in crisis. But then I have to take a step back from that, recognizing, as I said, my own emerging privilege, the fact that I grew up in Canada in relative safety and security, that issues like racism and structural inequality and the things that of course we dealt with as we do deal with it. In many ways, when I compare that to then the experience of members of my own community in Toronto who had suffered personal trauma, who had gone through displacement, who had come to Canada as refugees, who were seeking asylum in Canada, who had seen and witnessed terrible things, who had been born directly into personal trauma and crisis. And those are brothers and sisters from Afghanistan, from Somalia, from Palestine, and from other parts of the world, well, then you start to get perspective, and that's when I, in a way, I start to get perspective. Well, I may have an imagined sense or a sense of trauma and of crisis that developed from sort of like a political view of what this thing called the Ummah was. But here I was actually surrounded by individuals who, some of whom were peers, some of whom were aunties and uncles, others who were people who were new to the community, who, our family and other families invited into our homes and became friends with, who had actually gone through real personal experience of trauma. And that begins to change. Then that actually gave me perspective on, well, what does actually trauma mean? What is the sense of trauma that I feel? And in comparison to the trauma that wasn't just felt but was experienced by the communities around us. And then I became interested to see, well, I had this sense of the Ummah and the Ummah being in crisis, and the need for us to do something about the spiritual community that I belonged to, connected by a faith, but incredibly heterogeneous and diverse when it came to nation, language, ethnicity, cultural background, and so on. Well, what did they make of this sense of crisis that I felt? And I saw sort of two trends emerging. There was those individuals who, because of what they had gone through themselves, amplified, in a way, became amplifiers for this sense of collective trauma that, quote unquote, Muslims in the Ummah had, and others for whom my sense of being part of a community that was in trauma and crisis, actually, they kind of dismissed that and said, well, you actually don't know what trauma and crisis is. You haven't been through it. I've been through it. And there isn't really a sense of ummah. There is no spiritual community. Where was the spiritual community when I was being driven out of my home in Somalia? Where was the spiritual community when Israeli occupation forces were destroying my family's home? Where was the spiritual community when the home of my grandfather was being crushed by Assad's regime in Hama? All of a sudden now it was a sense that, well, I know about trauma, I know about crisis, I don't know what you're talking about. So I think this creates now a sense of trying to parse out what is my own personal sense of trauma, loss, wounds, and what are those that are experienced by individuals of their own accord. But then for me, a third level comes in, and that was really in a way going back into my own personal history. And I think we all have this this struggle and maybe a personal project. Maybe all of us have this personal project, is that we seek to reach back into our own personal histories, not only to understand the traumas that our grandmothers and grandfathers and great-grandmothers and grandfathers and our elders went through, but we want to understand why we are who we are. And for me, I had grown up with a sense of what had happened in 1947 with the partition of the Indian subcontinent into India and Pakistan. I knew that our family was from the Indian side of the Punjab, and the Punjab was one of two provinces, Bengal and Punjab, that were actually split at the time of the partition of the subcontinent after the British left the subcontinent. So I knew that my family, my father's side, was from Amritsar, which is the city, of course, which is most identified with the Sikh faith, the site of the Golden Temple. My family was from Amritsar. They had lived in Amritsar for probably 5 or 6 generations at the very least. My mother's family was from a village outside of the city of Jalandhar, also on the Indian side of Punjab. And I had always heard stories from my parents about the great migrations, of the fact that Muslims from what became the Indian side of Punjab had come to the Muslim Pakistan side of Punjab, and Sikhs and Hindus had come the other way. I knew about the great migrations of partition, the trauma of partition, the tragedy of partition, the millions of lives lost, the viciousness, the barbarity some of the actions of people during the partition. But in a way, it wasn't personal. I knew that my grandparents had gone through it, but it was later on that when speaking with my grandmothers, really, because my grandfathers both were in a way absent as the families undertook partition. My paternal grandfather was in Saudi Arabia at the time. One of the first, he'd gone in the late 1940s as one of the first Indian workers to work at Saudi Aramco. And my maternal grandfather was part of the civil service, and he was in Delhi when my grandmother and her family were forced to leave Jalandhar. But I think connecting with my grandmothers and understanding what partition meant to them and the trauma of partition and the fact that they were taking young children across this border, which was a border of death and destruction, in a way, it began to sort of clarify for me a lot of things about I think the sense of justice and the sense of injustice that my parents had. And I realized that so much of that was linked with the experience of partition, and that the experience of partition, having gone over that border and never come back, having left literally hundreds of years of history behind, in a way still influenced the way in which I believe my parents sort of addressed the issue of injustice and justice. And in a way, I think influenced the way in which they viewed the trauma of others. So I think that third, strand of thinking for me was actually really, really vital. And I think in the work that I personally have been involved in, particularly over the last 10 years, in terms of trying to harness positive religious narratives in the service of encouraging positive social action, social change, combating violence, and rising extremism, is that for me, what I have witnessed and what I have seen in Muslim communities here in the United Kingdom is a sense of that first strand, of that being part of communities that feel that they have legacies of trauma. Part of that is the mythology of the past and the present, but part of that is an amplification of the traumas of others and acquiring them as your own. So I live here in the East End of London. Amongst people, largely the population of Muslims where I live they're from Bangladesh. They're from an area of Bangladesh called Sylhet. Many of them came in the 1960s, but the high waves of immigration were in the late 1970s and the 1980s, and has continued. In the particular district of Tower Hamlets, which is the London borough which I live, the population here is probably 40% Muslim. And that's the area I live. It's one of the most deprived areas of the United Kingdom, but also one of the areas that is quickly gentrifying, and we're only a 5-minute walk from the city of London, the financial heart of the United Kingdom, and one of the financial capitals of the world. And yet, in my experience over the last 10 years, in terms of addressing Britain after 7/7 and after 9/11, and within the current security situation that we find ourselves in, the securitization of Muslim communities, and all the problematic issues that brings up, what I often see is that young British, Bengali men and women identifying incredibly, for example, with the Palestinian situation, identifying incredibly with the people of Iraq, now with the people of Syria, deeply and at a very profound level. And when I say profound, a lot of that is reflected in the amount of giving that happens, in the amount of fundraising that happens. If you go to Jummah in the area, you'll find that people are raising funds for Palestine, for Syria, and there's a sense that this is our crisis, that it belongs to us. Now, many of these young people born here in London's East End, many of them have grown up in deprivation. Many of them have seen deprivation around them, certainly, whether that's sort of working class poverty, whether that's educational underachievement, whether that's issues around wealth. Those exist, or poor housing, poor opportunity, working opportunities. Those are things that they see. Many of their parents went through incredibly traumatic experience of 1971 and the independence of Bangladesh, and many of the people would probably have witnessed the viciousness of the Pakistan Armed Forces in 1971. And so there's a sense, there again, that third strand that I talked about earlier of trauma, not hidden in our past, but in our not certainly hidden in our past, but in our past. That there's definitely a trauma there, and I wonder to what extent that works on communities, how we grow up with that sense of what our sense of justice and injustice is, and how we respond to that based on our personal experience. Yet at the same time, in the community that I live in, there's a very large and growing Somali community just across the road, sort of behind me. There's one of the largest Somali mosques in London. It's a very active masjid. It's not only a place of worship, but it's a place where a lot of people come to hang out and spend time. And a lot of these men and women who attend this mosque are those who have gone through incredible personal trauma. And that personal trauma has been living through civil war, having families ruptured, and we know a lot of that of the Somali narrative. But it's also in the fact that they are here and that they are making it work. It's stories of incredible resilience and strength. And I think every story of trauma, in many ways, masks a story of really resilience and strength. So, what does this all mean? What does this mean in terms of us as activists? Well, for me, as I reflect on this, it brings me to something that my dear friend and teacher, Mark Gonzalez, often talks about. And Mark deals with, and Mark has worked with Project Communitas in the past, and he was at was it the training or the national conference you did last year?
Yeah, the collab.
At the collab.
Yeah.
And I mean, Mark often speaks about this, and he says that when we imagine, and I find this really inspiring, and I often come back to it in my own thinking, is that he talks about, okay, we understand that there's trauma. So part of that may be apprehended trauma, a part of that may be personal trauma, part of that may be trauma in our past, which has an incredible and profound impact on our present, even though sometimes we may not even realize it. But then Mark challenges us to see a time before trauma. And that really struck me when he first told me that, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, is that imagine a time when you weren't in trauma. That really made me pause, because see, I grew up in that first category of believing that I was part of a community that was wounded and in trauma. The trauma of colonization, the trauma of empire, the trauma of loss of dignity, the trauma of being carved up into nations, the trauma of being subservient, that whole narrative of trauma about political, social trauma. But to imagine a time before that. And I think that in a way is right across the board, because I think what can sometimes happen, and I don't mean this in a flippant way or in a mean way, but actually in a very measured way. What often happens is that trauma becomes the thing that feeds who we are. That the sense of being wounded, the sense of being hurt, the sense of having injustice done to us becomes a constant. So it becomes a constant that the Ummah is in crisis. It becomes a constant that I went through trauma and I am dealing with it every day, and I have been traumatized, and that needs to be recognized. Or it's a sense that I am in rage because of a trauma that my parents may have experienced, but I certainly feel the trauma that others have. right now. And I think what that does is it locks us. It locks us into a cognitive frame where we only see ourselves and our identity and who we are and what we do as a product of our trauma. But we do not see us and who we are as a product of generations of wisdom, resilience, of civilization, of success. We don't see our past, and we look at our past. I'm not saying the mythologized past, but actually a past which was ennobling and which was inspirational. That we are descendants of remarkable women and men and remarkable personalities. That there was a time when they weren't in trauma. There was a time when they were sowing seeds and building communities and raising children without fear, without a sense of, without being in a state of injustice. I apologize for the sirens in the background. I don't know if you can hear them. There has to be a kind of an imagining of a time before. And if we can imagine a time before, we can also imagine a time after. A time of profound building, a time of creativity. And that time for us can be now. And I think it's moving that sense of a time before trauma and a time after trauma that allows us to deal with the trauma as not a permanent state, but as something that we can heal out of. That there are wounds that can be healed, or there are wounds that can be recognized, or that there are wounds at least that we can get on the road to healing. But that shouldn't be a crutch for us to move forward. And I think part of what, in my experience, and I mean I offer it humbly, and when I say that, I really mean that maybe we got it all wrong. But in our experience, part of what's been important is to create. I know it's like the ultimate cliche, right? Create safe spaces. Well, everyone's creating safe spaces. It's all. But I really actually believe that there's this sense of what are the kind of spaces that we create? What are the kind of spaces that we curate that allow us to express the truth of our trauma and our wound on our own terms, but at the same time allow us to imagine the thing that comes after it and the thing that came before it. I think the need for those spaces is absolutely vital. And the need in those spaces to speak truth is also vital, because in the globalized reality that we live in, the global, cosmopolitan, intersectional, interconnected web and networks that we exist in, the truth is that we have profound connections, and that those experiences of either the trauma that we've personally experienced, or the trauma that we take on, or the trauma that we feel on behalf of others, of course, has incredible global resonance. And at the heart of it, there are numerous political, social, spiritual issues. And I think there are those spaces where we need to be able to speak those truths on our own terms. As difficult as they may be, as unpopular as they may be to some, as dangerous as they may sound to those who are in power, we need a space to say them, and say them without fear. Because fear is, I think, one of the greatest enemies in dealing with this notion of trauma, this idea of not being able to speak truth. So I'll give you one example, programmatically. A little example programmatically of one of the ways in which we sort of took this on. So when we began the work of Radical Middle Way, and much like projects like Project Communitas and others, we received grants from governments. We had to negotiate some very, very difficult policy terrain. We were engaged in a policy field that wasn't always popular, and yet at the same time we had to sort of, in some ways, as in terms of the work that we were doing, be constantly pushing back against those who are funding us, but also trying to create space within our own communities for those kinds of conversations to happen. So I remember one of the early things that we undertook was creating these sort of safe cultural spaces, and part of what we did was we held these sort of national hip hop tours, and these were sort of we organized them, we imagined them, and the first tour that we did was a tour called Dangerous Ideas, and it featured the American poet and MC Amir Suleiman, the amazing UK MCs Poetic Pilgrimage, a female duo, Muhammad Yahya, and a number of others. And I remember, part of Amir, who's a a deaf poet champion, and is now well known for his incredible artistic and cultural and spiritual output. Amir does this poem called Danger, and I think many of you will be familiar with Danger. And Danger is one of those remarkable pieces of art that you might have heard it 100 times, but the 101st time it'll be forced to move you. It'll move you. And there's nothing you can do about it. It takes over you because it's such a powerful statement. It's a powerful statement of someone who's in deep pain, who's deeply wounded, has experienced personally, and whose community has experienced, and whose life has been shaped by trauma and traumatic things that are happening in his life and that are mirrored in the world, that are embedded in his past. So whether that's slavery or uprising against slavery, or whether that's empire, or whether that's occupation, or whether that's white supremacy, those are things that are powerful in Amir's poem. And there's a moment in Amir's poem where there's a kind of a catharsis. If you have a group of 200 or 300 kids listening to Amir's poem, and they've heard it online, maybe they've never heard it before. There's a moment about 3/4 of the way through where honestly they're about to explode. They're about to jump out of their seats. And I remember at the time, someone sent a note to one of our funders and said, you can't be funding programs like this, and you can't let this go ahead. This poem is an extremist poem. It inflames the passions of those who are there. How can official government grants be used to support work like this, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I remember I was given a call by somebody, someone from the ministry that had granted us these funds, and said, well, we've received a complaint about this. And I remember sort of saying, well, if you got a problem with this, you pretty got a problem with our approach. So if this is a problem, you can have your grant back. And he said, no, that's not what we're saying, and so on and so forth. And needless to say, the program went ahead, and Amir would always sort of speak about that poem, and to not just contextualize it, but actually to lay plain what it meant. But why do I talk about that poem, and why do I talk about that experience? I talk about that poem and that experience because of how important it was to have a space where that could not only be expressed, but that could be unpacked and talked about. Where that could literally, we could have a conversation about what a poem like Danger meant, and why it was so important. Why it was so important for those words to be said. Because I think the power of those kinds of cultural spaces is for us not merely to express the trauma and pain that we feel, but to have that heard by one another, to have that as a shared experience, to know that there's elements of this which we all feel, and they belong to all three strands. They belong to the trauma that we feel on behalf of others. They belong to the personal trauma that we have felt. They belong to the trauma that our elders have felt. That we can connect to that, because ultimately many of these traumas are related. There is a result of profound political forces and a political past, and it's important not to depoliticize this. but we need to create spaces in which that can happen. Now, those for me, in many ways, are what I would call dangerous spaces, and I think those in some ways are some of the most important spaces that we can be part of, and those are some of the most important spaces that I think we can certainly create. Those are my initial thoughts. Sorry for being so long-winded, and I do hope that somehow that made some sense. But over to you, Stefan, to interrogate that.
To interrogate. I think you brought some really brilliant ideas, and definitely some things that redefine the nature of the work that we're doing. I'm thinking the first time we met, we knew each other digitally before physically. But you mentioned that resilience is a word of BS, and I thought that was quite interesting, and it's something that's kept in my mind because it's a word that everyone kind of understands what it is, but no one really has. There's not an agreed upon definition. It's kind of like part of the. We could talk about like plastic terminology, like things like justice, freedom, good, and I think resiliency falls in there. But with regards to your discussion today, there's one particular point that I'd like to talk about, and then we could take Sahar's question afterwards. But you kind of mentioned that there's a process that, or maybe it's not a process, but there's a relationship, a very important relationship between crisis eventually becoming trauma. And you mentioned that earlier on in the conversation, but I kind of wanted to unpack that idea because, for example, a crisis can be a relational crisis. A couple that ends up fighting over doing dishes, or simplistically, but that in essence may not necessarily be traumatic. But that fight may become traumatic when it becomes a memory. When a story becomes so impactful that defines that relationship. So what do you think of the process? Like, when does a crisis become a trauma?
That's a really fascinating question. I mean, part of it is the construction of that, part of it is, I think, in a way, internalizing the crisis. Let's take the couple and the dishes, for instance. I and my partner fight over who's going to do the dishes or who's going to do the housework. That leads to all kinds of judgments that I make and that she makes about who I am and my sense of self-worth and my contribution to the family and my contribution to the home and my contribution to the relationship that we're building. Over time, that sense of crisis on this point now starts to become a broader narrative, right? A narrative of conflict, a narrative of the way in which we see each other, a narrative of our relationship. For so many reasons, the relationship continues, but we continue to develop these ideas about each other. This is not such a crazy thing. I mean, particularly, I can say that many of us have seen within our own extended families. I know I've seen in my own extended families. People who stay married, in this case, married to each other, but who despise each other. I mean, they stay together because they're there for the kids. How many times have we heard that? Well, we stay together for the kids. But along with that, there comes a sense of hurt, a sense of life unfulfilled, and now a narrative starts to form, a story starts to form around that. So all those things that were crisis points at the beginning, lack of communication, lack of participation in the house, issues around money, not understanding one another because you were coming from different cognitive frames when you were speaking about certain issues, now becomes part of a broader story. And I think if you were to transfer that to the sense of what I think in many ways certain members of my generation grew up in was we were constantly told. In many ways, I think we were constantly told within a Muslim frame that we, the Muslim Ummah, had lost something, that God had taken something away from us because of what we had become, what we did, who we were. Why had foreign powers been able to colonize us? Why were we so weak? Why did we not have economic or political power in the world? Why was our blood so cheap? Why were our nations so weak? So on and so forth. So that sense of constantly seeing and being aware of what you thought your nation was, in inverted commas. These are all imagined communities in some ways, aren't there? To quote, I thought it was Benedict Anderson, is that these are all kind of imagined communities. We imagine these things as being real, and some people will say they are real, and I'm open to discussing that, and open to acknowledging that. But they are real in a way that you feel really connected to them. Well, if you grow up always thinking that you're in crisis, that's actually a traumatic thing. That is actually a traumatic experience to be in. And one of my mentor and colleague at the Radical Middle Way, and before that at Q News, the Muslim magazine, Fuad Nahdi, would often give this anecdote that after 9/11, he was interviewing he was interviewing in communities, going out into homes in East London and West London, up and down the country, speaking to people about the impact of 9/11 and later on of 7/7. And I remember he has this great anecdote about walking into a home in the East End of London where the family there, the mom and dad or the elders in the family struggle with the English language, but they have satellite television and they're watching Al Jazeera. And all day Al Jazeera Arabic is constantly talking about this is happening in Afghanistan, this is happening in Iraq, this is what's happening in the Muslim world, this is the crisis in Somalia and in the Yemen, and. And they may not even understand the Arabic language, but what they do understand is, and when he would ask them, he says, why do you watch this? Because you don't even speak Arabic. He says, well, we know that they're telling the truth. This is the station that tells the truth. Well, you grow up with that. You grow up with a constant sense of the images of a community. In I mean, it's going to affect you. It's going to affect the sense of who you are as a Muslim, right? In whatever that imagined community is, you're gonna imagine yourself. I mean, I turn on some of the Islamic channels here in the United Kingdom, and the month of Ramadan is about to begin. And basically, in Ramadan, 24/7, it's going to be fundraising, and I'm going to be bombarded with images of violence, of poverty, of deprivation, of homelessness, of people in crisis. And we're going to see that again and again. I remember I worked with a very senior reporter at CNN on a documentary after 7/7, and we traveled across the country interviewing people and taking stories. And I remember I took this very senior journalist once to a major Muslim channel, and we were going to interview somebody there, and we were waiting in the control room, and after about an hour of waiting and watching ad after ad, she kind of got up and said, I need to take a break from this. He said, I watched ads like this, I've watched it for an hour and I feel agitated. If I watched this for 12 or 13 or 14 hours a day, or if it was always on in the background, I go crazy. I definitely would feel like I had to do something about it. And so I think that's when crisis becomes a trauma, and that trauma becomes something that is a constant state of being. We are constantly in trauma until we do X, until we create the caliphate, until we create this to rectify, until we do this. And so, and many times, because of our inability to deal with that trauma or that sense of trauma, or that crisis which has become trauma, we imagine almost fantastical utopian solutions. And actually what becomes difficult, and what I think many of us would have noticed in our work, is that it's very easy to get excited about problems that are not happening in your own community. It's
Mm-hmm.
very easy to get motivated. Not that I'm not suggesting that easiness to get motivated means you shouldn't do anything about it. The two are not mutually exclusive. But you see so many people who are engaged in foreign crises, and international aid and relief and all of those things, but they live in communities where there's profound deprivation, where
Mm-hmm.
there's poverty, where there is profound social economic issues that are at the very heart of the communities. Um, and, kids who are in a bad shape, things like drug abuse, relationship violence, all kinds of issues, and yet those become secondary because they're dealing with the bigger crisis. And I think that's also part of the dilemma. So how do we deal with being globalized, and being cosmopolitan, being connected to all these global realities, while at the same time, as activists and as organizers, not losing a sense of, well, I'm in a community, I'm based in a real place where there's real people, and around me there's a real reality. And from a Muslim spiritual perspective, this is a particularly profound sort of contradiction, because while we are, as the Prophet would have said, a community which feels the hurt of any part of the spiritual family that feels hurt, that the ummah is like a body, and when one part of it hurts, the rest of it feels it. We are also a faith which was founded on a profound way on a sense of neighborliness. That who are your neighbors? The 40 houses to the right of you, to the left of you, in front of you, and behind you. That a person is not a true believer if he has his fill and his neighbor goes hungry. And I mean that turns a mirror on me. The
Mm-hmm.
likes of me who are overweight and overeducated and privileged in many ways. How am I utilizing that privilege? How am I aware of the fact that my own privilege and my own sense of ease is not mirrored around me, and I live in that kind of that kind of part of the world, that in inner city East London, when I look around me, there are many signs of that kind of economic and social difficulty. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think parsing out what this trauma means, what the impact of trauma and crisis is, has a profound impact on the way we are in the world. And I think part of this question of resilience, and you're right, the word resilience has become such a kind of strange word that people just kind of throw out there. Well, let's become resilient. Well, what does that mean? Does resilience mean putting up with stuff? Resilience mean change? For me now, I think in many ways, resilience means having the tools to deal with crisis, but also being able to see, as Mark would put it, a time before trauma and a time after trauma, and kind of trying to facilitate the tools for people to imagine what a time after healing would look like, and then to
Mm-hmm.
get down to the work of healing. Now that's hard work, and that's work that many of us will engage in, in the micro. But that's why this is to use another, kind of euphemism these days. That's why they made this as a global conversation, because we are globalized. And the fact is that because of our personal histories, whether those are our spiritual histories, whether those are the histories of our own nationalisms, of our own migrations, of our of the way in which we moved around the world, so many of us are multilingual, so many of us feel multinational, so many
Mm-hmm.
of us in our own family units, whether with our partners or in terms of our parents or in terms of our familial groups, are multicultural. The experience that we actually have is not of having one foot in each in a different culture, but actually having both feet in 5 places at the same time. We're constantly playing this dance, and we
Mm-hmm.
have this ability actually to change rhythm very quickly. I can be an East Ender when I want to be. I can be a Canadian when I want to be. I can be British when I want to be. I can be Punjabi when I want to be. I can switch between languages. I can turn up my Islam and turn down my Islam. I can play up my spirituality. I mean, we're making all these choices all the time, isn't it? But that's the
Mm-hmm.
nature of what we live in. That's actually, in a way, that is our capital, right? We have this ability to move nimbly and sometimes not so nimbly, between contexts, well, I think that's a strength. That actually, we have huge communities of people who are multilingual, multicultural, multinational. Well, why don't we see that as a strength? Why don't we see those experiences as a strength? And even the experience of trauma, and having actually survived through trauma, the fact that we're here, despite the trauma that we faced, and last year, Mark and I worked on a project called Storytelling Somalia, where we were involved in bringing together 35 young creatives, changemakers, journalists from the Somali diaspora, and had about 5 days to talk about what stories that heal, not stories that harm, look like, and look at the issue of trauma, and look at the issue of tribe, and to really engage actually with stories, and in many ways that was a very difficult experience, because people came with a lot of sophisticated ideas, which didn't always mesh with our ideas or the ideas of those around them. But that's what made it such a powerful place, because we were constantly negotiating what trauma and personal history, and for the Somali friends who were there, which were at the heart of the program, in many ways for them, I was sort of witness to this very profound and sophisticated negotiation that was going on, really around this issue, right? How do we live with the trauma of what has happened in Somalia? And yet, what I was seeing around me was many people who were deeply, deeply scarred, and who had gone through, really deep pain. But the people who I was seeing in front of me were confident, creative, sophisticated, intelligent, powerful, deep actors and change makers. So right in front of me, I was seeing individuals who had been through some of the most profound and gut-wrenching traumatic events, and yet, when I looked at them, it's like, wow. And there wasn't a contradiction there. Many of them were the people who they were because they went through that pain, but the powerful way in which they'd been able to take that and turn that into profound creativity or profound intellectual depth was remarkable and humbling, actually. So in a way, we can see. I feel like I can at least say that I've seen individuals who've been able to really pull through the experience of trauma and begin to create beautiful things, and actually create beautiful things. And that's powerful, and I think that's an energy, that's a source of energy that as organizers we need to, not in a utilitarian way, harness for some diabolical end game, but I think that as organizers we need to say that is an incredible capital within our communities, and there's incredible capitals for healing, those are incredible capitals for visioning, and then how do we bring people around the table to vision together? How to create those spaces that I was speaking about, where we can vision together and actually take action together.
Great. That's exactly what I was yearning for in terms of an answer. We are kind of running out of time, and
no problem.
Maybe if you want to share a few last words.
Yeah, if there's any questions or any comments from your end, or for anyone who might or might not be listening.
We have Sahar who asked just a question, kind of a clarification regarding the idea of dangerous spaces that you mentioned. So she wrote, in today's environment in Canada, would these dangerous spaces be seen as safe spaces for youth to release their trauma, or as something dangerous? How can we ensure they are seen as safe spaces?
It's a really good question, and I don't know entirely the answer to that, because in a way, this is the straitjacket of the political times that we live in, isn't it?
For sure.
In a way, a space can be safe and dangerous. Why? It can be safe because it's a place that we feel open enough to say what is on our minds, and in a way that we can mediate those ideas. It's dangerous because things may be said that are unpopular, unpalatable, not politically correct, not consistent with the political tenor of the day, in a time when particularly Muslim communities are seen as suspect communities, when there's policies of securitization in Canada, whether it's C-51 or whatever else that is. That's what we're seeing. But one thing I would say is this. I mean, in Canada this week, we've seen the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, isn't it,
Yeah.
around Aboriginal peoples, and we've been seeing, I believe it's the Chief Justice in Canada.
Last
Correct me
week.
if I'm wrong. Yeah,
Yeah.
making some very bold remarks about Aboriginal peoples.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think as Canadians, we have to come to terms with the fact that we live in a country where systemic undermining, genocide, violence was done to First Nations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is now being recognized in the main. We've always known it to be true. It's now being recognized in the main. And I think that part of the incredible story of Aboriginal peoples in Canada, and part of the incredible trauma they've gone through, and yet the fact that they remain is actually a testament to safety and the safe spaces and the dangerous spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Because in many ways, our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, elders, I would say, many of them have been speaking difficult truths to power for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and have been raising issues in the wilderness when no one would listen to them. And many in the Aboriginal community have sought political recognition, have sought to be at the table, at times walked away from that table. But now, I think after all these years, there's at least a public acknowledgement by those in power and privilege, those who have power and privilege, that in fact there is the profound truth, big T, in the fact that of the historic injustice,
Mm-hmm.
and the systemic injustice is at the very heart and core of the Canadian story, and it's a black vein running through the Canadian
Mm-hmm.
story,
Mm-hmm.
the story of subjugation and empire, and there has to be recognition of that. And there's a lot of Aboriginal peoples who've been saying dangerous things, who've been talking about resistance, but in many ways in the safety of tribe and community, and sometimes not so safe. We actually have a great privilege in actually having the ability to create some of those spaces. And I think part of the challenge today is, I mean, there's part of it is how do we speak to our neighbors, how do we speak to our societies around who we are and what we're feeling, but part of it is our citizenship. I mean, I don't even think about it anymore. It's just, we're Canadians. We have certain rights and privileges, and we take those on. I think we have to make very strong arguments about who we are and the role that we play in the communities and societies that not just that we live in, but that I'm part of. I'm born in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I've never felt other than Canadian. And the times that I haven't felt Canadian, it was probably because stuff was going down. But I think my mother was always, I think she was one of those people who came over from her home country, and I think even before my dad, she was always like, "We're here, you are here. You're a Canadian. You better stick it out, son." Right? Because
Mm-hmm.
there ain't no other option. This is who you are, and this is where you are. And I think part of it is that we need to have the confidence to speak plainly about how we're feeling. I think in some ways we need to speak in a savvy way about where we're at, and what's going on in our communities. And I agree. I think we're entering into a difficult time, where we're often sometimes speaking truth is going to be a dangerous thing to do. Well, that's why it's important that civil society is active. It's important that we're creating those resilient institutions. But it's also important that I think that it's also important that we are creating particularly cultural spaces and building cultural capital, because I think often cultural spaces and cultural capital is where some of these more difficult conversations can be had.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that is done through the lens of artistic production and curation, and in a way that's very profound, and actually can speak way beyond our communities in a far more visceral and direct way. And so I think at this moment in Canada, we have incredible opportunities for solidarity. with others who are fighting injustice. We also have, I think, I mean, at the risk of pushing the envelope, I think we have a duty
Mm-hmm.
in this time of legal narrowing to unite with our friends who are in favor of free speech and civil liberties, and many of our friends in the progressive movements. This is a time for solidarity and for consciousness building and for speaking truth to power, not only on our own, but hand in hand with those in our country who believe in the importance of of open dialogue and to speak plainly. And
Mm-hmm.
this is a time that I would say this is a golden time for solidarity. And in those spaces of solidarity, we hopefully can build the confidence to speak plainly and sometimes speak dangerously, and to also find a way of mediating those conversations. And I'm not just talking about throwing verbal grenades out there and seeing, oh, let's see if we can shake things up by what we say.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about very purposeful talk, very
Yeah, yeah.
purposeful action, that in one way is measured, but that also allows for young people in particular to express themselves. And I think the worst thing that we can do is suppress that expression.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
expression should be done openly, and then we should find ways not of mediating it, but for understanding and building conversations around it.
Mm-hmm. Did we lose you?
No, I'm still here. I'm still
Oh,
here.
we heard quite the thump. So
Oh, sorry. It's probably me banging on something.
after that speech.
Yes, exactly.
Um, Great. That's I think we have a lot to think about, and we're in an interesting time where there's such political changes and political shifts that we really need to think, what is our place in this society? What is our relationship to these policy changes, and what is our relationship to those who are suffering oppression, especially, I mean, myself, white Canadian, French Canadian, so I have a bit of a history of repression, but so it's definitely quite the project that we have to do as a society, and there's going to be a lot of work, but it's interesting times.
Definitely.
So I want to thank you for joining us, and this is something that's going to be very beneficial. So just like to kind of break it down to you, we're developing a toolkit actually, which will refer to some of the things and the ideas that you've shared. Because like you said, it's resilience means having the tools to be able to cope with trauma and to cope with crisis before it becomes a trauma. So I think it's really important. So with that, I want to thank those who joined us. And to thank those who will join us when we're not live. So thank you very much, and I hope everybody has a good evening.